Chapter 16. Bhumika. The entire household gathered to watch Priya and Sima go. Bilu pushed gifts from the kitchens into Priya's hands, then directed his attentions to Sima when she protested that she couldn't possibly carry everything. Even Kritika offered them both a respectful farewell and promised to keep them in her prayers. Finally, Priya took Padma from Bhumika's arms and pressed kisses against Padma's cheeks and into her curls, then swore laughingly when Padma yanked at her braid in return. "Goodbye, egg," she said. "Don't swear like me, or your mother will skin me, you understand?" Priya raised her head and met Bhumika's eyes. Her expression grew graver. "I'll be home before you know it." She and Priya had never been good at uncomplicated affection, and Bhumika could not bring herself to embrace Priya now, when it would feel too false or too vulnerable, too much like an admittance that she feared she would never see her sister again. "Keep yourself safe," Bhumika replied. She took her daughter back, and if her hand grasped Priya's for one moment, gripping her fingers tight, then that was Bhumika's own business and no one else's. "I'll see you again in the Sangam," Bhumika said. "Go." Priya nodded, her eyes a little shining, a little wet, and then turned her head and walked away. And that was the end of it. Her sister was gone. It was no surprise that Bhumika slept badly that night. She woke the next day in the early pre-dawn with a sense of unease. "Someone is here," she thought. Kalita, perhaps, bringing Padma to her, but when she blinked open her eyes and stood up, no one was there. A headache clawed sharply at her skull. She stumbled through her morning nauseated. She managed to feed Padma, then demurred when Kalita offered to bring her something light to eat. "Kichadi, perhaps," Kalita suggested, but Bhumika winced at the thought of trying to stomach anything and refused. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "If you can find Kritika, tell her I'd like to speak with her in my study," Bhumika said. She wiped Padma's face clean and smoothed back her hair. "I will see you later," she whispered, and brushed her lips over her daughter's forehead. Padma made a contented noise. It was Jivan, and not Kritika, who came to see her first. He entered with a bow. There was something cupped between his hands. "Bilu sent this for you, milady," Jivan said, keeping his voice low. Kalita had clearly told him Bhumika was not feeling at her best. He placed the cup in front of her. "Tulsi boiled in water," he clarified at her questioning look. "Bilu assured me it should help." She smiled, a little wryly, and lifted the cup. It was warm, a fragrant green scent rising from the steam. "Bilu thinks Tulsi cures everything," she said. "Your sister," he said, gazing over her shoulder, "is of the opinion that Bilu believes hashish cures everything." "Jivan!" She felt her smile deepen. "I didn't know you liked to gossip. I'm shocked." "Kritika is on her way, milady," he said. "Shall I remain?" "No, you've had enough to do. Kritika is no trouble." Jivan's silence was somehow both respectful and deeply skeptical. Bhumika covered her amusement by taking a sip of the Tulsi infusion. The warmth was pleasant, soothing, but it did nothing to ease her headache. Perhaps Jivan should have brought her hashish instead. "If you need me," he said. "I'll summon you," Bhumika said. "Of course." He bowed again, and then just as swiftly as he arrived, he departed. Kritika arrived soon after. She wore a pale sari, her silver-white hair bound back neatly with beads of wood. "I am sorry I'm late, Elder," she said, seating herself across from Bhumika. "I was on the Hirana, seeing 2 morning pilgrims." Her tone implied heavily that Bhumika should have been seeing 2 pilgrims, as the only true elder left in Ahiranya. There was no point arguing with Kritika. Bhumika had learned long ago that there were battles not worth fighting. "I wish I could go more regularly than I do," Bhumika said. "I'm thankful for your help," she added with as much sincerity as she could muster. Kritika had once been a rebel against Parijatvipan rule and fiercely loyal to Ashok. Ever since his death, she had dedicated herself to the spiritual care of Ahiranya and to ensuring that her fellow ex-rebels would have a position of respect in the new city that was being built in the absence of the empire. "So," Kritika said, "what need do you have of me?" I know you want your people to pass again through the deathless waters, said Bhumika. If you have to select few who are willing, Kritika, I believe it is time to try. Of course you are finally allowing it, Kritika said. A bad start. She did not sound pleased, as Bhumika had vaguely expected she would. Instead, her mouth was thin. If I may speak freely, Kritika added. You may, Bhumika replied, inwardly bracing herself. We follow you because Ashok made a vow that he would obey you, and we still believe in him and always shall. But you're barely clinging on, Kritika said bluntly. The city is still in disarray. Peace is tenuous. One disastrous harvest, one full rebellion from the highborn, and you lose everything. You have had need of us to grow in strength for a long time, and you allow us our rights only now, after throwing your sister into the Pradijatipans. She took a deep breath. It riles me, Elder. Perhaps there would be less disarray if any of you had the patience for the dull work of keeping a nation functional, Bhumika thought. Silently, she let the irritation form, then drift away. She sipped her tulsi water. The deathless waters are dangerous, Bhumika said instead, treading over an old argument with steady footsteps. They may kill any of you. Tenuous as my power is, I cannot afford to lose anyone. It has made me rightly cautious. My men and women are strong. Strong people have been killed by the waters before, Bhumika said quietly, as you know. When Kritika remained silent, Bhumika said, That I offer this at all is a sign of my regard for the mask keepers, and my desire to see us build Ahiranya together. I will be glad for powerful allies. Then we should all pass through the waters, so you may have as many powerful allies as it is possible to have. Bhumika shook her head. The ache in her skull briefly sharpened. Forcing back a wince, she said, For all of you to make the journey would be an unwise risk. Kritika was still frowning. You have waited this long out of respect for me, for Ashok's memory. Mostly, she knew, for Ashok's memory. I ask you to trust my guidance in this, too, as he would have wanted. I will wait, Kritika said eventually. If anyone must wait, I'll accept it. I will ask a few of my brothers and sisters to share my patience, but not all. They have the right to become twice-born, Elder Bhumika. Bhumika inclined her head. Kritika. Yes? You need not call me Elder, Bhumika said. I have told you so before. I show you the respect I would have shown Ashok, Kritika said with a stiffness that was all brittle grief. Ashok would never have asked you to do so, Bhumika said. But he did, said Kritika. He made us all promise to serve you, Elder Bhumika. So we shall. She paused, clearly struggling with the desire to speak. Then quite sharply she said, But if I or any of my fellow mask keepers were to consider turning on you, and we would not, I would point out that you are tainted by your association with the Parijatvipan Empire, your marriage, your child. Tainted, Bhumika repeated flatly. I would point out that our country still does not have the freedom it was promised. Someone could easily claim you are another region in all but name, a Parijatvipan creature ready to keep us under the Empire's boot, who won't allow her fellows power. I would make it clear how easily you could be toppled, but I keep Ashok's promises for him, Elder Bhumika. There is no need to threaten me, Bhumika said tiredly. I have already agreed, Kritika. I was not threatening you, Kritika said, sounding genuinely affronted. If I were threatening you, I would use my sickle. Then you have good reason to keep me alive and in power, Bhumika replied. She gave Kritika a grim smile as she rose to her feet. You have no sense of the kind of weapons the highborn use, and if you do, you wield them entirely without subtlety, Bhumika thought. Know exactly what weapons the highborn use, Kritika said. I have lived under their boot in a way you cannot comprehend. Wealthy and protected as you have been, Elder, I simply believe in more honest weapons, as I believe in more honest Ahiranya. The sooner we can rise and put the weapons the Empire gave our people aside, the better. That is what I believe. That evening, Bhumika reached for Priya in the Sangam. The shadow of her moved through 3 knotted cosmic rivers. The shadow of her voice called, Priya, Priya, where are you? Priya did not answer her. I need you to send one of your men after Priya. Those were the first words she said to Jivan when he entered her chambers and bowed, eyes sharp with concern. She had summoned him directly to her after the second time she had reached for Priya and found no answer. Now, she was standing by the window, staring out at the growing darkness, forcing herself not to pace with anxiety. She had never reached for Priya and found nothing before. Never. Urgently, the swiftest rider you have. He nodded. What message should the rider carry? Jivan asked. I merely need to know if she is well, Bhumika said. Ask your rider to carry ink and paper so she can send me a message if she needs to. Bhumika touched her knuckles to her lips. Stop. Think rationally, she told herself. Do not allow yourself to be driven by your own worry. I cannot reach her, Bhumika said eventually, in the way we usually reach one another. I fear for her health. There was a silence behind her. She turned to look at him and saw that Jivan's expression had hardened. I can send 12 men on fast horses, he said. More if need be, if you wish me to go myself. No. She shook her head. No. 1 rider will be enough. They could not afford to weaken their own defenses, and Bhumika was not one to shy away from grim truths. Priya was strong. If she was well, 1 rider would be enough to confirm her safety and survival and put Bhumika's fear at ease. But if something had happened to her, something so grave that she could not even enter the Sangam, then no number of soldiers would be enough to save her or fight what had harmed her. Her heart ached at the thought. She pushed the fear away desperately. I need you here. He nodded his understanding. I'll send one of my best, he vowed. I have every faith in you, she said. She tried to sleep after that, but it was hard. Every time she slept, she woke soon after with a jolt, worry bitter on her tongue, and her heart hammering in her chest. She had only 1 sister left. Only 1. When dawn came, she felt as wrung out as a damp cloth. But she rose to her feet, reached again into the Sangam, and found, again, nothing. Kritika had gathered a group of masked keepers she felt were suitable to pass through the deathless waters. She had insisted there was no point in wasting time. In truth, they should have completed the ritual during the festival of the Dark of the Moon, Kritika had said archly. I remember how things once were, Elder. And Bhumika had not argued. She had spent yesterday afternoon giving instructions for flowers and fruits to be carried up to the Hirana and for the pilgrims to be dispersed. They would be barred from the temple until this was done. Then, more discreetly, she had located an empty plot of land in the orchard. Those who did not survive the journey would need a suitable burial after all. If there was one thing Bhumika took little joy in, but understood the necessity of, it was ritual. She remembered passing through the deathless waters as a girl, the dread and determination that filled her, the white tunic she'd worn, and the way she had brushed her own hair until it shone, and prayed with her siblings around her until the moment their elders came for them and took them to the waters. She had not known if she was preparing for her funeral or her rise, but she had promised herself she would not die, and held that promise close as she lowered herself into the waters once, twice, thrice. Now she tried to cobble together something resembling the ritual of her youth. The mask keepers were told to bathe and dress in their plainest clothes. Then, as dusk fell, they met her upon the Hirana. A shrine room had been especially prepared. There was a plate of silver resting beneath the dozen of effigies of the Yaksa. Now she instructed the mask keepers to lay their offerings there. Coconuts hewn open, thick with flowers, fresh fruit, a handful of polished coins. They prayed together in one cramped shrine, the scent of incense coiling through the air. As a child, Bhumika had prayed because it was a task woven into her life as a temple daughter, as essential as breathing or eating or sleeping. Now, she prayed because it was what was expected from her as the High Elder. But she could not deny that there was comfort in the act. The familiarity of the movements and the words, the smell of sandalwood incense and the cold dark beneath her eyelids as she closed her eyes and bowed her head. It brought her childhood close, enclosed in her smallness. And there was her magic now, of course, the living, breathing hum of the Hirana beneath her, responding to the waters in her blood. The pulse of all Ahiranya's green, pressing its seeking fingers into her skull. Once she had prayed and felt as if the words were a plea to the nothing, and no one, unheard. But now she reached for the green and felt it reach back. Even if the Yaksa did not hear her, the green did. Let some of them survive this at least, she prayed. Let them live. The Hirana had its own will and always responded best to Priya. But Priya was not here, so it was Bhumika who listened to the Hirana, the way its surface altered beneath her feet, the ripple and shudder of stone guiding her to a new gap in the ground, a new staircase leading them down to the deathless waters. She watched the masked keepers slip into the still depths and very carefully did not think of her brother. There were 3 masked keepers who died, 4 who lived in the end. The 3 were buried in the orchard before dawn, in the milky gray light that preceded true daylight. The masked keepers who had told her they wanted to dig the graves themselves, with our own hands to honor the dead, they said. But Bhumika joined them regardless, dressed in her plainest clothes, her hair bound back into a knot. She brought Bilu and Rook with her. Ganam was ankle-deep in soil when they arrived. He looked up at her, his face shiny with sweat. If there were tears mingled in with it, she did him the kindness of not noting it. "Elder Bhumika," he said, "you're not needed for this. We're strong enough to get the work done." She did not point out to him she could turn the earth over with a single breath, without lifting a hand. That would have been cruel, and her intent today was to put cruelty aside. The bodies lay near, swathed in cloth. Someone had placed flowers on them at the throat, the stomach, the feet. "It would be an honor to assist you," she said, and waited. After a moment he nodded and offered her a shovel. If I could help," Rook said tentatively, his voice thin. I was a rebel once." "I thought I'd also lend a hand," Bilu added, as if Bhumika had not sought him out, had not said, "You have strength. They'll be grateful for it." "No need," said Ganam. Bilu grunted, said, "I know you'd do the same for any of us." It was well done. Ganam's guarded gaze softened. "It's not up to me who helps or doesn't," Ganam said gruffly. It was hard work turning up the soil. She had never done it before with hands alone, her magic set aside. Her last living blood relative, her beloved uncle, had died by fire. Her husband had been cremated in keeping with the customs of his own people, and Ashok had drowned in the deathless waters. His body had never returned to the surface. Sometimes she dreamt of it still, deep under the weight of the waters, chained by fronds of leaf and root, blue in the glowing half-dark, cold under her reaching fingertips. But she had never truly touched it, never covered it with cloth or flowers, or wept over it, or laid it in a grave. Now she dug relentlessly, no magic behind the heave of her arms. By the time the hole was deep enough, she'd sweated through her clothes. She could hear Rook and Bilu still working behind her, breath huffing out of them. They had moved on to their second grave. When they were done, the masked keepers began to lower the bodies into the earth. For a moment, Bhumika caught her breath. She listened to the muffled sobs from the watching, the heavy breaths from the ones carrying their friends. Then she began to sing a prayer. Her voice came out of her clearer and stronger than she had expected it to. Steady. Some of the masked keepers looked at her, recognition dawning in their eyes. Although the Ahirani language had long been suppressed by the empire, although their tales and their books had been erased and forbidden, The mask keepers knew their birch bark mantras. They knew the shape of prayers for the dead. Kritika had appeared at some point during the digging. Her sari was mourning white, her face drawn with grief. She looked at Bhumika. After a moment she joined in. She knew the cadence, the words. The bodies were lowered with care and reverence. The earth was piled back over them. Gandam wiped a hand over his forehead, leaving a streak of mud behind. Then he raised his head and looked at Bhumika once more. Around him, the other mask keepers did the same. There were probably things a temple elder should say in such a situation, but she could not remember how her elders had grieved whenever Bhumika's siblings had drowned or died, poisoned by the deathless waters. Had they grieved? Death had always been such an inevitability and proof of weakness and failure. A temple child who died had been undeserving. A temple child lost perhaps did not deserve to be mourned. You can pray too if you wish, Bhumika offered gently. Gandam looked at the other mask keepers, silent communication passing between them. It doesn't seem our place, he said. You will be elders too, soon enough, Bhumika said. People will look for you to pray and worship with them. She gestured her head lightly at the graves, covered now with soil. They will be glad, I think, to be sung to by you. All of you. Their voices wavered together, rising as the sun rose in the sky. Khalida had prepared the bathing room for her without being asked, which was relief. And Padma was covered in a layer of mysterious grime, so Bhumika took her into the bathing chamber with her. She managed to lull Padma into stillness with the careful distraction of a story about a magical deer, and oiled Padma's short curls, softened them to a buttery coils as she made the noises of the various animals to keep her daughter entertained. Then ran water over Padma's hair, careful to avoid her eyes. Now, she said, lifting Padma up, this is what you were looking forward to, isn't it? She held Padma in the basin of water. Padma beamed at her. Bhumika thought of the way water could consume you and change you and kill you, and how quietly, sweetly healing it was to hold her daughter up in a small basin and watch her splash at it with utter delight. It made Bhumika smile in return. Padma slammed a hand into the water and drenched Bhumika's lower face. For half a second, Bhumika could only blink and splutter, and then, quite suddenly, she was laughing. And Padma was laughing back, her little joyful mirror always marveling at her own chaos. It was only once Padma was dry and drowsing on Bhumika's bed that Bhumika realized her headache had returned. Bathing, pouring warm water over her limbs, had eased the pain briefly, not long enough. She rubbed her fingers against her temples, sighing. Before she could even consider whether she wanted to try Tulsi again or something rather more effective, Khalida entered. "My lady," Khalida said, "you need to dress." She offered Bhumika a pale salwar kameez, waiting until Bhumika was dressed before continuing. "I've arranged your meal. Khalida stopped, mouth still open. She was looking out the window. Bhumika had a sudden sense of shifting, as if her headache had tightened like a noose and twisted the world with it. Dizzying as if she had passed through deep waters and risen to sunlight, but the water had gathered in her lungs. Her ears were ringing. With some effort she followed Khalida's frozen gaze. The flowers at the window had curled, moved. The edges of the vines had sharpened, knife-like. The blooms had deepened to a riotous bloody red. It took her a moment to realize that the conch of warning had been sounded. She snatched Padma up and strode from her chambers with Khalida at her side, down the corridors, out into the courtyard, by the watchtower on the walls. Elder! The soldier was one of Jivan's old recruits, and he stumbled between one form of address and the other. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of people calling themselves pilgrims outside. There are always pilgrims, Bhumika said, firm but calm. Explain. Not for you, he bit out. They're following something, someone. The gates flew open. No hands had forced them, no hands should have been capable of such an act, and Bhumika felt the strangeness again. Something new choking her from within, something coming. Leaves everywhere. They were not growing through the walls. They were roiling, rising, and tumbling as if caught in a great wind, pouring through the open gates, filling the air. She raised a hand to protect Padma's face, but did not allow herself the same kindness. She looked through the tumult. There were pilgrims indeed, a whole swath of them standing beyond the mahal's walls, visible only in glimpses between the green swirling before them and around them. An eye here, a length of hair there, a shoulder, an arm, a faceless torso. One figure stepped in front of the rest, walking slowly, steadily toward the mahal. Bhumi should perhaps have told her soldiers to prepare for a fight, told them to gather their weapons to form a perimeter, but those were not enemies in front of her, not warriors, and whatever this was, it was a thing driven by magic and not men, magic that she felt in her bones. The figure was before her, the leaves parted and fell gently. A familiar face stared back at her. For a moment his mouth moved soundless, as if he was trying to understand the shape and shift of his own facial muscles. His face, the wholeness of it, the shape of his jaw, the cut of his hair, he looked as he had on the day he had entered the deathless waters. Entered and not come back. "Ashok," she said. Her voice sounded distant, even as she felt her own mouth move, her own heart hammering, faint with a nausea that threatened to swallow her. "Bhumika," he said. He too sounded dazed. "I found my way home." The tension in her skull fell away. "You died." Bhumika's voice wavered. Her whole body threatened to waver. "Priya and I, and your rebels, we waited for you, by the deathless waters. We waited." She'd stood by the water for a full night, leaving Padma in Kalida's care, watching the gleaming, shining blue of it, and hoping, even as some terrible part of her had been glad she would not have to fight him in the days and months and years of Ahirani rule to come. "You were gone." "Priya isn't here," he said in reply. She wasn't sure if he intended it to be a question or a statement. "No," Bhumika said, lips numb. She wondered if she would swoon like some kind of soft maiden, if he had brought her to this. We waited. By the waters. You died." I didn't die." He didn't try to move closer to her. His face was strangely blank. His hands were flexing at his sides, opening, closing, fingers moving. I do not think I died." "You did," she thought with absolute certainty. It was not the new strangeness writhing inside her that told her. It was her own familiar gut instinct. It was the way his skin had not changed from sunlight or the lack of it. It was the leaves that surrounded him and clouded the air. It was the absence of him in the sangam. She was breathing unsteadily, her body unable to resist the brunt of the shock roiling through it. Only Padma's weight against her skin kept her steady. He was far too uncannily himself, a picture painted a shade too perfectly. "I didn't come alone," he said. Behind him she saw pilgrims fall to their knees, murmurs of prayers and cries, an ecstasy of weeping. "It was inevitable," said Ashok, "like we were inevitable, like the tide. When you have lost people, they haunt you in ways large and small." Bhumika had always known this. She dreamt often of her brother, her uncle, even of her husband, strange dreams that verged on nightmares that woke her with salt in her eyes. She did not dream of the temple council often, but she had not forgotten their faces. She recognized the moment she saw them, 4 figures standing behind Ashok. Elder Chandni, with her familiar gentle eyes, Elder Senthil, his face carved in forbidding lines, and there next to them, oh, no, 2 of her siblings, Sanjana with bright eyes and laughter on her lips, Nandi, small and wide-eyed, still a child, and forever a child. They walked toward her. As they walked, green things rose from the earth, buds, soft ferns, life forcing its way out of the ground. Flowers blooming like a mantle from their shoulders and hair, arms flecked with swirls of wood. Bhumika could only kneel. It was not awe that took her to her knees, but a lesson carefully written into her when she was so young that it became part of her blood, her bones, and could not be later undone. You show the Yaksa veneration her elders had taught her, even in image, even in echo of them. Bhumika, said the Yaksa in Chandni's face, smiling, speaking in her dead elder's voice, our temple daughter, we have finally come home.